In late 1915, World War I was being fought in the trenches of mainland Europe. Britain, France, and Russia were allied against the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottomans. The war in Europe was stagnating, but Britain urgently needed a strategy as to how to divide the Ottoman Empire with France should the Allies be victorious. The Prime Minister turned to a young British politician called Sir Mark Sykes, who had cast himself as the government's advisor on the Middle East.
The Ottoman Empire is assailed by misfortune, crippled by myriad vices, and the prey of alien greed, ambition, and timidity. Englishmen may have ideas, but they are unable to take any steps to overturn the regime and free the peoples under its power.
By the 3rd of January 1916, he and the French lawyer turned diplomat Georges-Picot would have negotiated the terms of a secret agreement.
In 2 words, I foresee a protectorate regime which uses the local traditions and customs to establish different regimes in the 4 provinces of Syria. Lebanon, a Lebanon enlarged by the annexation of Beirut, Tripoli, the Bekaa, and serving as a model of what is necessary to achieve with the indigenous elements in Palestine, Damascus, and Galilee.
These 2 men devised a plan that would not only divide the spoils of the declining Ottoman Empire between the 2 European powers, but would draw lines in the sand that would ultimately influence the shape of the Middle East for the next century. Istanbul, capital of an Ottoman Empire that had stood for 6 centuries. It spanned the 3 continents of Asia, Africa, and Europe. Its peak had been in the 16th century.
ابتداء من القرن السادس عشر بدأ في هناك الدقية الروسية موسكو تتوسع وتتحول تدريجيا إلى دولة بالغة الأهمية ثم إلى إمبراطورية كبيرة جدا، وأصبحت تشكل قلق كبير على الحزام العثماني في الشمال. طبعا كان هناك أيضا النمسا، بريطانيا وفرنسا ابتداء من القرن الثامن عشر بدأت تصعد هذه القوى باعتبارها قوى ذات قدرات عالمية في البحار ومستعمرات ما خلف البحار.
في القرن الثامن عشر بدأت هزيمات للدولة العثمانية، وبدأت الدولة هناك خلل خاصة في الصناعة، لأن الدولة العثمانية لم تكن الدولة الصناعية، كانت دولة الزراعية وتجارة. ما استطاعت أن تفهم هذه التطورات في أوروبا، خاصة التطور الثورة الصناعية.
هذا التغيير في ميزان القوى هو الذي بدأ في حصار الدولة العثمانية وفي دفع الدولة العثمانية في عدة مناطق، سواء في الجزائر ثم بعد ذلك في مصر إلى الخلف. ليس هناك انحطاط عثماني كما كان يتصوره البعض، ولكن حصل تدريجيا هناك تغير كبير في ميزان القوى في العالم دفع الدولة العثمانية إلى الخلف.
The Ottoman Empire began receding in the 19th century. In 1830, it lost Algeria to France, while Egypt gradually came under British rule, which then expanded into the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabs of Mesopotamia, Greater Syria, and the Hijaz remained part of the Ottoman Empire, which was undergoing its own changes.
القرن التاسع عشر بدأت الحداثة وبدأ دخول الأفكار الأوروبية والديمقراطية أو المجلس إلى داخل الدولة العثمانية. في عهد عبد الحميد الثاني أول مجلس الموجود، وبعد ذلك في بداية القرن العشرين مجلس الثاني. هناك كل الممثلي الشعوب موجودة من العالم العربي والأقطار العربية، ممثلين من لبنان وشام ومصر كانوا موجودين.
In 1908, the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turks, overthrew Sultan Abd al-Hamid II and restored the 1876 constitution. This reduced tension at the top of Ottoman politics, but also created anxiety among Arab groups in the empire.
كان لهذه المجموعة ميول ديكتاتورية، كان لهذه المجموعة ميول إثنية وعرقية، أي يعني كانوا ممكن الواحد يعتبرهم قوميين أتراك، أو على الأقل كان عندهم نزعات قومية تركية، وهذا كان مستحيل دمج هذه الأفكار بدولة ذات قوميات متعددة.
كأنه كان في هناك شعور لدى قادة الاتحاد والترقي أن سيطرة الدولة المركزية ليست كافية، أنه ينبغي تعزيز سيطرة الدولة وقدرات الدولة، بمعنى ينبغي تعزيز مركزة الدولة. هذا الذي أعطى انطباع بأنه لدى هذه الحكومة توجهات تتريكية، أنه إذا كان في مراسلات المحاكم باللغة العربية ألغيت مراسلات المحاكم باللغة العربية وأدخلت اللغة التركية، لأنه هذا هو مقتضيات المركز.
By 1914, you could really say that for those Arabs who were engaged in identity politics, what they aspired to was a better deal for the Arabs within the Ottoman Empire. This brand of politics is known as Arabism. And Arabists were really thinking in terms of imitating the Austro-Hungarian Empire with a kind of Arab-Turkish dual monarchy in the Ottoman Empire. But were very concerned not to exit the Ottoman umbrella for fear that were the Arabs ever to make a bid for independence, they would be immediately at risk of European domination.
The Ottomans suffered a major defeat in 1912 at the hands of Bulgaria, Greece, Serbia, and Montenegro in the First Balkan War. They lost the bulk of their European territories, but the defeat did initially ease the relationship between the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire and the Young Turks in government.
العرب أيضا تأثروا بصفتهم مواطنين عثمانيين بالنتائج المؤلمة لحرب البلقان، والدولة العثمانية الآن أصبحت أكثر حرصاً على وحدة ما تبقى من ولاياتها والتفاف عناصر الدولة المختلفة حول الدولة، وبدأ التوتر يتراجع. ولكن طبعاً في العامين الأولين من الحرب العالمية الأولى عاد التوتر من جديد.
The First World War started at the end of July 1914. Britain, France, and Russia fought the Central Powers of Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Bulgaria. Shortly after, the Ottomans opted to support Germany.
الخيار العثماني الحقيقي الأول كان هو الاصطفاف إلى جانب بريطانيا وفرنسا وروسيا، ولكن الروس بشكل أساسي كان لهم أهداف توسع في منطقة المضايق، ولم يكونوا حريصين على يكونوا الطرف العثماني طرف شريك لهم.
روسيا خاضت الحروب ضد الأتراك 12 حربا على مدى 3 قرون، واستولت على القريم وأزاحت السيطرة العثمانية من المناطق الجنوبية الحالية لروسيا، من كوكاس، من بلقان، وهذا كان صراع جيوبوليتيكي لفترة طويلة جدا. والمصالح الإمبريالية الروسية كانت تقتضي امتلاك الممرات يعني الطريق السهل من البحر الأسود إلى البحر الأبيض المتوسط إلى أوروبا.
الروس دوما هذا الهدف الأساسي كان الوصول إلى المياه الدافئة، وإمبراطورية مثل الإمبراطورية القيصرية الروسية وهي قارة بحد ذاتها لم يكن عندها المنافذ المطلوبة، كانت تريد، ومن هنا المرور إن كان عبر الدردنيل أو عبر البوسفور هو المفتاح نحو المياه الدافئة.
In February 1915, frustrated by the stagnating war in Europe, the British opened an eastern front against the Ottomans on the Dardanelles Strait. They imagined the Ottoman army as weak and easier to defeat, as a way of taking on Germany and ending the war. Russia, however, was more concerned about its use of Ottoman waterways, so the Russians asked Britain and France to sign an agreement to guarantee their own share of the spoils after the war.
The Russians were keen to seize more as cultural capital, as a sort of restoration of Orthodox Christianity after 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. And so with the outbreak of the First World War and on the eve of the Gallipoli invasion, the Russians wanted to secure their allies' commitment to granting Istanbul and the Straits to the Russian Empire. And this becomes an exchange of documents known as the Constantinople Agreement, concluded between March and April 1915.
Britain, France, and Russia entered into the Constantinople Agreement, which granted the Russians certain Ottoman territories and waterways. However, this agreement paved the way for another secret deal, as London and Paris started to plot exactly what they wanted from a region that was gaining strategic significance in the coming age of oil.
You can really say that Britain entered the war without any clear territorial ambitions in Arab territory. They could not, at the stage of the Constantinople Agreement, identify one place that they wished to add to their empire, but they reserved the right to do so as soon as they'd worked out what their priorities were. And so, in a sense, the Constantinople Agreement really is the first of the wartime partition agreements that will begin to shape the way in which the Arab provinces will be carved up, primarily between Britain and France, since Russia's interests lay mostly in Turkish territories.
So, in very British fashion, the British created a committee called the De Bunsen Committee, and its remit was to look into the options for Britain, so that when the time for negotiations with the French came up, the British would be well prepared and know what they wanted. And this is actually something that the British did throughout the war and right to the end of the war.
So in April 1915, the British set up a committee headed by the diplomat Maurice de Bunsen to define their interests in the Ottoman territories. It made certain assumptions about what its ally France would expect from any potential deal.
اللجنة عملت في ضوء الاعتقاد السائد في لندن في ذلك الوقت أن الفرنسيين يريدون الليفانت بمعنى سوريا الكبرى. إن الفرنسيين كانوا يقولون إنه إحنا من أيام الحرب الصليبية إحنا إن مصالح في هذه المنطقة، إحنا إن دور تاريخي في هذه المنطقة، إحنا إن علاقات وثيقة بهذه المنطقة، وإحنا نريد هذه المنطقة.
Britain's interests were most likely to be in completing its imperium in the Persian Gulf by securing the territories of the provinces of Basra and Baghdad, linked as they were to Persian oil fields in Abadan Island in the Shatt al-Arab, and nicely completing a dominion that stretched right around the Arab coastline of the Persian Gulf, which had been in place since the 1820s.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. So the De Bunsen Committee was set up, and its youngest, most junior and most carefree member was Mark Sykes, who was Kitchener's military assistant. Kitchener was the Secretary of State for War, and he delegated the job of sitting on the committee to Sykes.
Mark Sykes had been born into a wealthy family in Yorkshire, in the north of England in 1879. He studied at Cambridge University and was elected as a Conservative Member of Parliament in 1911. He liked to give the impression of being an expert on the Middle East based on his travel in the region. But he was not quite the authority, as it was sometimes assumed. He presented the de Bunsen Committee with his vision of a new Near East.
This region has riches, I tell you, and this will be our opportunity.
Sykes had come up himself with a different plan, which was something completely different and much more old-fashioned. And that was to create a cordon across the Middle East. So he was planning to divide the Middle East between France and Britain and create a belt of English-controlled country that stretched across from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains on the Iranian frontier, and acted essentially as a frontier that Britain could control and keep other people away from the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. That was rejected by the de Bunsen Committee. The older, wiser heads said, no, that won't work.
You're out of your mind.
In July 1915, the de Bunsen Committee recommended dividing the Ottoman Empire into several provinces over which Britain would seek influence rather than exercise direct control. But when Sykes was sent to the Middle East and India, he began to revert to his original idea of a British cordon, from the Mediterranean to Iraq.
So, Sir Mark, from your knowledge of the Arab question, where would you say that allegiance lies? Between us and the French, I mean?
Practically all Arabs are pro-English. Not exactly anti-French, but frightened of financial exploitation, and they are frightened of French colonial methods.
But there are many Christians in Syria, in the Lebanon in particular. How do they feel?
The Christians are as afraid at the bottom of their hearts as the Muslims.
And only in Syria?
That feeling, sir, is prevalent everywhere. Because they know what the French do, that feeling pretty well runs all through. There's the French Nationalist Party, which is sentimental, still harking back to the Crusades.
So Sykes returned, and as these currents sort of started to come together, he was called into Downing Street at the end of the year, on the 16th of December 1915. And then he must have gone with a map as well, because he got into the meeting with the cabinet, the Prime Minister and his chief ministers sitting round the cabinet table in Downing Street.
I believe they fear an Arab caliphate, which is an independent state, the common language of the Arabs of Tunis, Algeria, and Morocco.
Which, of course, they control entirely.
The French nationalists believe that if the Allies win, they want Syria, Palestine, and North Mesopotamia.
Sykes appeared to be someone who was very knowledgeable, and in fact, in that cabinet meeting that he went to in December 1915, the result of the cabinet meeting was that one of the cabinet ministers who was there believed that he could speak Arabic and Turkish, but in fact he could speak neither language. So he dotted his speech with Arabic phrases, that sort of thing, to give himself the appearance of being an expert, when in fact he was more of a gifted amateur.
What do you think we should do, Sir Mark?
I think to counteract the French war aims, we require diplomacy.
What do you think diplomacy will achieve with the French, Sir Mark?
I don't want to make any suggestions except on very general lines. But I feel we ought to settle with France as soon as possible and get a definite understanding about Syria.
What sort of arrangement would you like to have with the French? What would you say to them?
I should like to retain for ourselves Palestine,
south of Haifa, apart from the enclave of Jerusalem.
وفي هذه الجلسة بالذات كأنه مارك سايكس بدأ يأخذ في الاعتبار ليس فقط الميناء والطريق الآمن إلى البصرة من الشرق المتوسط إلى البصرة، ولكن أيضا أنه التقارير المبكرة حول احتمال وجود نفط في منطقة كركوك.
It's most important that we should have a belt of English-controlled country between the Sharif of Mecca and the French in Syria.
Where do you leave the French?
I should like to draw a line from the Ian Acre to the last K in Kirkuk.
And this must all be settled before we can take military action against the Turks in Syria. We must find out what the French actually insist upon having. They demand the whole of Syria.
It cannot be merely a military proposition.
We must make terms with France, which means we must make terms diplomatically.
Quite so.
Britain had identified the territories of the Ottoman Empire it wanted in order to protect its interests in the Suez Canal and the Arab provinces. But this plan was dependent on Britain and France winning the war, which at the start of 1915 was almost at a standstill on the Western Front in Europe. The Allies decided to open an Eastern Front against the Ottomans. The ill-fated Gallipoli campaign ran between April 1915 and January 1916. When it finally failed, the Allies, including Australians and New Zealanders, suffered a major setback. This monument commemorates the Ottoman victory in which around 80,000 Allied troops were killed. This defeat at Gallipoli and later in Kut in Mesopotamia caused the British to enter into more secret deals over the Middle East. Coming up, how the British conspired with Sharif Hussein of Mecca to strike back at the Ottomans through an Arab revolt.
The British looked on the Sharifs of Mecca as the partners that were essential in the propaganda war with the Ottomans to demonstrate that the Muslim world was better off on the Allied side than fighting with the Ottomans.
Let me explain why we must have...
And Sykes and Georges-Picot negotiate face-to-face to get what they both want from the Middle East.
Well, if we cannot have Palestine, my government will certainly not allow Britain to control it.
And my government would take the same view. French Palestine would be an outrage.
Well, then we need to find another solution before we come to blows.
And so, now we can draw a map. We must retain full control.
In late 1915, early 1916, both Britain and France were exercised by how they might divide up the ailing Ottoman Empire between them, should the Allies ultimately win the First World War. But when they suffered a serious defeat at Gallipoli, Britain looked at alternative ways of attacking the Ottomans and undermining their support for Germany.
That now the Ottomans, on a victory roll, might be able to provoke uprisings in the Indian and Egyptian Muslim populations that so far they'd not been able to affect. It's at that point that Britain begins to really consider how it might turn the tables on the Ottomans and force them to fight in their own territory against an internal uprising. So, to address that challenge, they turned to the Sharifs of Mecca, who had already made overtures to the British about concluding an alliance to secure their position. Now, all of a sudden, the British looked on the Sharifs of Mecca as the partners that were essential in the propaganda war with the Ottomans to demonstrate that the Muslim world was better off on the Allied side than fighting with the Ottomans.
In 1908, the Ottomans had appointed Sharif Hussein bin Ali as the Wali, the governor of Hijaz, the area towards the Red Sea. He was from the Hashemite dynasty in Mecca, of which he was the emir. His sons Faisal and Abdullah were representatives in the Ottoman parliament, but his relationship with Istanbul had deteriorated in recent years.
بدأت أعتقد مشكلة الشريف حسين قبل الحرب العالمية الأولى، أنه القوة الصاعدة في إسطنبول 1908-1909 هي الاتحاد والترقي، والاتحاد والترقي هم أبناء النخبة العثمانية الحديثة، وهؤلاء لم يكن لديهم قدر كبير من الاحترام للقيادات التقليدية، قيادات مثل شريف مكة الذي تعود فكرة حكمه للحجاز إلى أنه هو وريث الأشراف اللي لهم قرون وهم أسسوا أمارة في الحجاز.
كانت الأغلبية الساحقة من النخب العربية في الولايات العربية للدولة العثمانية تسعى لحكم عثماني يعكس الديموغرافية العثمانية، أي حكم يعكس وجود العرب والأكراد وغيرهم. طبعا تغير هذا الوضع مع اندلاع الحرب لعدة أسباب، منها تصرفات الدولة العثمانية في البلاد العربية وخاصة حكم جمال باشا في سوريا، منها الحقيقة المحاولات الإنجليزية خاصة لاجتذاب العرب.
The Ottoman ruler of Greater Syria, Jamal Pasha, executed a group of Arabs in Damascus and Beirut in 1915 and 1916. They were accused of being separatists and of supporting the British and French. This hardened the determination of the Arab nationalists to separate from Ottoman rule and to create an independent Arab state.
Hussein didn't have any modern ideas of nationalism, but he wanted more autonomy under the Ottoman Empire, but it's only gradually that he was drawn into what became an Arab national movement, a full-scale revolt against the Ottomans. And this wasn't an easy decision for the Sharif of Mecca to make, because the Ottomans were fellow Muslims. And he was siding with an infidel power against fellow Sunni Muslims.
There had been conversations between the British and the Hashemites before the war. But in July 1915, Sharif Hussein wrote to the British High Commissioner in Cairo, Sir Henry McMahon. He offered his support against the Ottomans in return for British support for an independent kingdom that would include the provinces in the Arab Peninsula and be ruled by the Hashemites.
الشريف حسين بن علي ركز على ثلاثة مسائل. المسألة الأولى هي تحديد الدولة العربية بشكل كامل بأقاليمها الرئيسية الثلاث، اللي هو إقليم الجزيرة العربية، إقليم بلاد الشام، إقليم الرافدين، بلاد الرافدين. هاي الأقاليم الأساسية المكون الأساسي للدولة العربية كاملة. المسألة الثانية هي تأكيد استقلال الدولة العربية بشكلها كامل. المسألة الثالثة كما كانت في مراسلة شريف حسين بن علي ترتيب العلاقات المستقبلية مع بريطانيا وتقديم الأفضلية لها في الشأن الاقتصادي والعسكري في المنطقة.
The correspondence continued, and McMahon wrote to Sharif Hussein on the 24th of October, 1915. He said that Britain would not guarantee support for an independent Arab kingdom with all the provinces demanded by the Hashemites. Nevertheless, the Hashemites went ahead with their revolt against the Ottomans in July 1916. But many still consider McMahon's letter controversial today because of the areas the British wanted to exclude from any future Arab kingdom.
الحقيقة الذي رآه الشريف حسين هي ترجمة رديئة جدا وركيكة جدا للأفكار التي أرسلت من لندن في اللغة الإنجليزية للقاهرة والتي ترجمت هناك عند الريزيدنسي البريطانية. وبعض الأقسام السورية الواقعة في غرب دمشق وحمص وحما وحلب ولا يمكن أن يقال عنها إنها عربية محضة. كلمة الأقسام ترجمة غير صحيحة للكلمة الإنجليزية. الكلمة في اللغة الإنجليزية هي districts، أي مناطق، أقضية. يعني في عدة ترجمات ممكنة حسب شو كان بذهنهم الإنجليز، بس أظن هم كانت رغبتهم أن تبقى المسألة غامضة.
McMahon was careful not to promise anything that contravened pre-existing treaty arrangements. They wished to exclude territories to the west of Homs, Hama, and Damascus and Aleppo, and certain areas around the Gulf of Alexandretta and in Cilicia. And Britain was already in occupation of the province of Basra and much of the province of Baghdad at this time. And so Britain was very keen to declare its interest in retaining some degree of control over those territories for the mutual benefit of the Arabs and the British. Beyond those boundaries, that Britain would be willing to accept the Hashemite claim to Arab kingdom with British support.
Hussein thought that the British promised to include Palestine in his kingdom, and the British later denied that they promised him Palestine. They denied it outright, but all the evidence is that they had promised him Palestine.
طبعا إذا الواحد بيقرأ الرسائل البريطانية، رسائل سير هنري ماكماين للشريف حسين على ضوء ما نعلمه الآن من مفاوضات الإنجليز مع الفرنسوية وعلى ضوء فهمنا للطموحات البريطانية، من الواضح أنه للإنجليز غايات عديدة في تدوين هذه الرسائل. يعني كانوا يغطوا مصالحهم وكانوا يغطوا على اللي بيعملوه مع الفرنسوية.
Significantly, in the same month that the British promised parts of Greater Syria to Sharif Hussein, they told the French that any agreement relating to the borders of an Arab kingdom would not be finalized without their consent. They knew how strong the French interest in Syria was. On the 1st of October 1915, the French ambassador to Britain, Paul Cambon, wrote to his Prime Minister, René Viviani, to tell him that London had requested a French representative to draw the borders of an Arab kingdom with Syria. In this document, the French ambassador suggested François Georges-Picot, who'd managed the general consulate in Beirut for over a year and knew the Syrian issue better than anyone else.
Alors, François Georges-Picot est un diplomate. C'est un diplomate qui est un diplomate comme on les avait à la fin du 19e siècle et au début du 20e siècle. C'est un personnage qui a ses entrées au Quai d'Orsay parce que, en fait, son père, l'ensemble de sa famille est déjà très intégré dans le système diplomatique français. Et ce sont des gens qui sont bien impliqués dans ce projet colonial asiatique et qui s'intéressent très naturellement à l'Asie. Alors, il a eu un parcours de diplomate classique, c'est-à-dire qu'il se déplace de poste en poste. Et il se trouve que, par hasard, il est en Orient à Beyrouth, 1914.
Ah, Monsieur Picot.
Bonjour, monsieur.
Bonjour. Very nice to see you again. Monsieur George.
The French representative, Picot, had his first meeting with the British in London on the 23rd of November, 1915.
It's delightful to see you again. I believe that you know everybody else.
They started their negotiations about their respective shares of the Ottoman Empire once the war was over.
The British come along with an array of people from all the different ministries that take an interest: the War Ministry, the Foreign Office, the Colonial Office, and they all are sitting on one side of the table and Picot is on the other side of the table.
Perhaps you would define for us the boundaries your government desires.
We must, of course, have the whole of Syria and Palestine.
All of it?
Of course, down to the Egyptian border.
But Monsieur Picot, you must realize there are other claims in this area.
Perhaps the Bethlehem and Jerusalem could form a kind of enclave, but certainly nowhere else.
And despite the numerical advantage, Picot just sits there with his arms crossed and says, I'm not interested in your plan. It doesn't, we can't possibly accept something along the lines that you're talking about.
Moving further east.
We must have the land north of this line and across here, including Mosul.
Mosul? The town?
No, the vilayet, the whole area around it.
20 years ago, the vilayet of Mosul included the Baghdad and Basra districts. Are you suggesting they should be separated now?
It is impossible to consider the situation of 20 years ago affecting the situation now.
So, Monsieur Picot, if you have Palestine and Syria and half Iraq and Mosul, will you be satisfied?
I think I can persuade my government.
Then we have reached an impasse.
The uncompromising positions of both sides at that first meeting caused the British Army intelligence officer in Cairo to write,
"It is obviously hopeless to attempt to arrive at any reasonable agreement with the French, so long as Picot is their representative."
François Georges-Picot, c'est lui qui se retrouve en fait au commissaire en 1916-1917, au commissaire pour la Syrie et la Cilicie, et qui, parce que en fait, il s'intéresse aux populations arabes, parce qu'il est plutôt anglophile, eh bien, se retrouve à devoir négocier avec Mark Sykes, qui est la figure qui représente le lobby colonial britannique, et les deux hommes en fait vont être chargés d'élaborer ce qu'on appelle des buts de guerre. Et les accords Sykes-Picot sont typiquement ce qu'on appelle des buts de guerre, c'est-à-dire en cas de victoire, et seulement en cas de victoire, voilà comment on se partagera les territoires. Et il dessine en fait une carte d'un territoire qui n'existait pas et se partage en fait un monde qui est un monde quasiment désertique, c'est ce qu'on appelle les interlands, et qui vont dessiner en fait les structures des pays d'aujourd'hui.
So Mark, your government has been adopting extreme positions over a territory which you must recognize France has special claims to. But in the meetings I attended, no one seemed to give a centimeter. And yet, concessions, I feel, are essential. Decisions have to be made so that we both know where we stand when Turkey is conquered, as inevitably it will be.
Mr. Picot, I feel sure that within these walls, we can find a way through the issues. And my government has given me the power to make the necessary decisions.
I too have been given the freedom by my government to make the necessary decisions. And you must realize that we have very definite needs in a territory which some of my countrymen consider to be French by rights, ever since the Crusades.
You do remember who won the Crusades?
Yes, but today the Arabs have few Saladins.
Although these talks were secret, the Russians had already made their demands.
What we must do, now that we have agreed the Russians can have the northern areas of Turkey, including the Straits, is to discuss the southern and eastern areas so that the interests of both our great nations can be established for the decades that will follow the end of the war.
Well, let us start then with the provinces of Syria that center on Damascus and the Lebanon.
لم يكونوا يمانعوا لأن المنطقة الشمالية يعني اللي هي سوريا الكبرى أو يعني الجزء شمال حيفا من سوريا الكبرى أن تكون منطقة نفوذ فرنسي، لأنه أرادوا الفرنسيين يكونوا بفر، الفرنسيين يكونوا فاصلين بينهم وبين الروس. البريطانيين تصوروا أنه في نهاية الحرب إذا هزمت الدولة العثمانية حتكون منطقة الأناضول أو شرق الأناضول منطقة نفوذ روسي، فلم يكونوا يريدون مجاورة الروس.
So you see, it's indispensable for the Arabs of inland Syria to have some direct access to the Mediterranean, somewhere along the Syrian coast. With Lebanon in the way, under total French control, that would be impossible.
But that would mean French possessions would be split in two between the north and the south of Syria. That simply cannot be allowed to happen. Political and military administration would be impossible in such a divided territory.
Well, Monsieur Picot, I am not convinced. But let us nevertheless try to meet that objection. Now, my dividing line is here, from Acre to Kirkuk.
البريطانيين يريدون من ساحل المتوسط إلى البصرة منطقة آمنة، لأن هذا الطريق بديل وسريع نحو الهند، وكانوا يفكروا حتى أنه في المستقبل يبنوا خط سكة حديد توصل بين حيفا والبصرة. مسألة أخرى، البريطانيون بتوصية من تشرشل في سنة 1914، تشرشل وزير الأسطول كان في ذلك الوقت، حولوا الأسطول البريطاني من وقود الفحم إلى وقود النفط، ولأول مرة يصبح موضوع النفط موضوع استراتيجي للبحرية البريطانية.
It will not be possible to persuade my colleagues to accept a line as far north as that. That will exclude cultivable regions like the Haran from our sphere.
I see, but for France to control territory that far south, make it very difficult for our plans for a railway line from the coast to Baghdad.
I must insist on this point, Sir Mark. And Kirkuk?
We could not possibly let you have Kirkuk. From my own travels in the area, I know that this province contains the only elements of the population which will make it possible the colonization of Iraq.
My dear Sykes, this is hardly in a spirit of conciliation. Let me explain why we must have the territory we requested in northern Mesopotamia.
Les pourparlers entre Mark Sykes et Georges-Picot vont d'emblée se poser sur la place de la Palestine dans l'ensemble. Et les Français estiment que c'est à eux de continuer à être les protecteurs des chrétiens d'Orient et que c'est à eux de continuer d'avoir la main sur Jérusalem et donc sur l'ensemble de la Palestine. Ça, c'est le point historique que les Anglais ont du mal à rediscuter. Pour les Anglais, le problème, c'est de protéger le flanc droit du canal de Suez.
Well, if we cannot have Palestine, my government will certainly not allow Britain to control it.
And my government would take the same view. French Palestine would be an outrage.
Well, then we need to find another solution before we come to blows.
And so, now we can draw a map.
So when Sykes left the cabinet meeting on 16th of December 1915 to go and meet Picot, he had a problem because he had to reconcile two conflicting sets of demands. The set of demands that Picot was making for Syria and Lebanon, and the other set of demands that Sharif Hussein had already made and which the British had already effectively accepted, for both covering the same territory. So he and Picot came up with a map that made a distinction between two types of land in the Middle East. Land that Britain and France would absolutely control, which was coloured blue for France and red for Britain, and a hinterland, the inner region, which was called Area A and Area B, where the Arabs would have some autonomy, but in which each of the big powers, the great powers, would have the right to advise or influence.
With the further complication that the territory of what was to become Palestine was designated for an international zone where basically Russia, Britain and France, unable to agree who could lay greater claim to the Holy Lands, just deferred that decision down the road by painting it all brown.
In January 1916, the French and British agreed to ignore the borders of any future Arab kingdom. Their new borders were enshrined in the deal we now know as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes drew his line from Acre to Kirkuk, so the south of Anatolia, eastern Turkey, the Syrian coasts, and Beirut were put under direct French control. Basra and Baghdad were put under direct British control. Mosul and Damascus were put under French protection and were called Area A. The rest of Mesopotamia and the south of Greater Syria were put under British protection and called Area B. But Palestine, including Jerusalem, was designated as an international zone in brown. Although Sykes-Picot was never implemented, it formed the basis of future negotiations, and the post-Ottoman Middle East resembled the areas of influence it created.
So the map has different colours, different letters, but ultimately what really matters is the line in the sand that runs from the coast to the Persian frontier.
وكان مستحيل على الإنجليز أن يسمحوا بنشر خبر اتفاقية سايكس-بيكو. كانت هذه ضرورة لسبب واضح، ليس فقط لإبقاء الهاشميين إلى جانب الحلفاء، إنما أيضا لتجنيد جنود عرب من الأسرى في معسكرات الاعتقال في مصر وفي الجيش العربي لا يحاربوا مع الإنجليز، ومن شأن أيضا اجتذاب الشعب العربي في مناطق الدخول التي تدخل عليها القوات البريطانية.
In a funny way, the British felt that this system, that the Arabs so viewed as a betrayal, was in keeping with the terms of what they'd agreed with the Hashemites, because they were still considering the territories under informal British and French influence as kingdoms to be ruled by Arabs. And there was even one mention of the Sharifs of Mecca in the Sykes-Picot Agreement to round things out. But ultimately, for the Arabs, Sykes-Picot was double-dealing, and it seemed to be giving territory that had just been conceded to the Hashemites by the St. McMahon correspondence to the French.
Here, in St. Petersburg, in the Russian Foreign Ministry, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France was approved by Russia. The deal was finalized in correspondence dated the 16th of May 1916, influencing the future of millions of people in the Middle East.